Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik with Flying and Eating. Today, let's go somewhere and do something, and make sure to like, comment, and subscribe.
Hey guys, it's Adam here. I'm currently in Dallas, Texas, here at the JFK Memorial. Now, Dallas, Texas is, of course, an interesting city for a whole host of reasons, not least of which presidential history, obviously associated with the Kennedy assassination. Now, as you guys know, I am big into presidential history, so I thought it'd be interesting to do a special video since this is the 60th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination, which we could go around various parts of Dallas and show some of the historic sites associated with the assassination, tell them in linear order, and it's give some history as well as my additional take on any of these locations and moments in time. Welcome to a very special episode of Flying and Eating that consists of no flying and no eating, but a lot of sweating. Lee Harvey Oswald, the alleged assassin of President John F. Kennedy, lived here, along with his wife, Marina. I only say he was alleged because he was never put on trial and proven guilty. In early 1963, this location in Chicago, Illinois, was once known as Klein's Sporting Goods. It is worth noting that the Kennedy assassination tour is not limited to just Dallas, but more on that later. Klein's received an order for an Italian-made Garcano rifle to be shipped to a P.O. box in Dallas for an A. Heidel, a known alias of Lee Harvey Oswald. While never proven, the presumed reason for the purchase was so that Lee Harvey Oswald could acquire a rifle he believed incorrectly could not be traced back to him. It is presumed that it was meant to be purchased for the purposes of killing General Edwin Walker. Upon receiving the rifle at this residence, Lee Harvey Oswald requested his wife, Marina, take a few photos of him holding it, as well as the pistol, which was believed to shoot Officer J.D. Tippit, but more on that later. The rifle, of course, is also the one that was believed to have shot President Kennedy. This is the exact spot Lee Harvey Oswald is standing in those photos. It's marked by this picket fence behind me, as well as this frame here. When Oswald is suspected of shooting General Edwin Walker, it happened while he lived in this home. That incident occurred on April 10th, 1963. Now, while this was never proven either, Marina did basically claim that was most likely true. He, in fact, also included documentation saying, "In the event I am suddenly arrested, here are instructions," the same day. He then suddenly, for no apparent reason, decided to move a mere 2 weeks later down to New Orleans on April 24th. He went down there supposedly for work. While he was there, he was causing a lot of trouble with a whole incident known as the Fair Play for Cuba. He was trying to hold odd jobs, and he was unsuccessful. He would eventually make his way to Mexico City at the Cuban embassy, which would more or less say, "We can't help you, get out of here." He ultimately comes back to Dallas. Marina only goes down to New Orleans from time to time with the assistance of Ruth Payne, but she ends up living there, which forms their relationship. After returning from New Orleans, this is where Lee Harvey Oswald would live. He was not together with Marina anymore in an official capacity. They were married, but they were no longer living together. It is possible, due to his time in New Orleans, that he got somewhat radicalized. He was on some television shows down there. It is possible he got addicted to the fame and then saw this opportunity that was to come, and he took it. Here in Irving, Texas, we have the Ruth Payne house. Now, after everything fails to work out in New Orleans for the Oswalds, Marina ends up here. She had briefly lived here before they went down to New Orleans, but after that failed, she came back here ultimately to reside. Now, what interestingly occurs is in October, I believe 14th of that year, the neighbor, Ruth Payne, ends up having a casual conversation with her neighbor over here in this house with another neighbor who had lived down in a house down there, whose brother, as confusing as this may sound, is named Wesley Fraser. Now, Wesley Fraser had actually recently got a job at the Texas School Book Depository. He had informed his sister, who again lived down there, about the job opening, who had informed this neighbor about it, who then told Ruth Payne about it, who told Marina about it, and thus they inquired about the possibility of Lee Harvey Oswald getting a job at the book depository. Lee Harvey Oswald officially gains employment here via Roy Truly on October 16th, 1963. Roy Truly, who managed the building at the time, would go on to say later that the same day he had hired Oswald, he had actually hired someone else. And he needed one person to work here and one person to work in a facility 2 blocks away. Randomly, he chose Lee Harvey Oswald to be here. He often regretted that if he had simply swapped that very likely the assassination would never have occurred. The earliest the public could have possibly deduced the motorcade route would have been November 16th, 1963. Hardly enough time to have some sort of grandiose conspiracy. In addition to that, we must couple that with the idea of Lee Harvey Oswald being very politically interested. He was very well known amongst his wife, his family, his friends, etc., that he was very into politics, and any sort of matter of political discussion, he would talk about it. However, anything pertaining to the idea of Kennedy's eventual visit to Dallas, once that was known, he was known to hush up about it. His co-workers claimed at the book depository that he didn't seem to even know the motorcade was occurring. He also, according to Marina, would not talk about it. She apparently asked him if they could go see Kennedy Kennedy speak somewhere, he essentially said, no, and I don't know how to do that, and I don't want to talk about Kennedy. This is further evidence that he was perhaps trying to distance himself from the idea of being interested in the Kennedy assassination, which would ultimately lead to more people being suspicious of him. It is now November 21st, 1963, the day before the assassination. The Kennedys stayed here. This was once known as the Hotel Texas. Nowadays, it's called the Hilton Fort Worth. The reason the Kennedys were down here was political stumping. Kennedy himself was preparing for the 1964 re-election, and he felt Texas was absolutely essential in order to win. It was a state that absolutely carried him to victory in the 1960 election against Richard Nixon. He felt a trip down here was important, so he wanted to do a bunch of stops. He had gone to San Antonio, I believe he also went to Houston, and then he came to Fort Worth. The next day he would go to Dallas. Jackie Kennedy was never really with him for these trips, but due to a recent incident where they lost their son Patrick Kennedy, she was in mourning, he advised that she come with him along on the trip. On Thursday, the night before the assassination, Lee Harvey Oswald and Wesley Fraser were working here at the Texas School Book Depository. That night, Lee Harvey Oswald inquired with Wesley Fraser if he would be willing to take him to Irving, Texas to go back to the Ruth Paine home, presumably to see Marina. When requested as to what his motivation was, he simply said, "I need curtain rods." This is essential because this was extremely out of character for Lee Harvey Oswald. He only ever went there on weekends, but on this one night before the assassination, he suddenly really needed curtain rods. That evening when Lee gets to the house, he asks for permission to stay. Marina says with Ruth's consent it would be all right, which she did allow. Now that evening, as they spend the night together, he attempts to convince Marina to repair the relationship, allow the marriage to continue. Marina disagrees to that, which is purely speculative, but had she allowed him to stay, it's largely believed there's a very good chance the next day's events may not have occurred. It is now November 22nd, 1963, the day of the assassination. President Kennedy comes out here, roughly where this statue today depicts him. He ends up making a speech for the crowd, which ultimately turns out to be his final public appearance. It is worth noting that he actually went out into the crowd, abandoning his Secret Service detail, and just started shaking hands with the masses. After that brief speech, he goes back inside for a breakfast, ends up making an additional speech for a private group called the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce. That morning, Lee Harvey Oswald decides to leave his wedding band in a cup, symbolizing the fact that the relationship is over. Again, widely speculated that had the relationship repaired itself, the day's events may not have occurred. After that, he is seen leaving the house, heads down to the neighbor's house to meet up with Wesley Fraser, who would then drive him to work. He was seen carried not only by Wesley Fraser, but as well as the neighbor, Wesley Fraser's sister, carrying a brown package. This brown package, while never proven, was believed to be carrying the Garcano rifle that Lee Harvey Oswald ultimately used. When asked what this package contained, he simply responded, "curtain rods." So this is the house that Wesley Fraser and his sister lived at. Wesley Fraser's sister was actually the one who owned the house. Now, they were the only two witnesses to see the brown package. She reportedly saw him through this window, which means Lee Harvey Oswald pretty much stood about here at one point, carrying the Garcano rifle. He then would have proceeded from here, around here, to the car, and then would have that morning left for the school book depository. Behind me is a parking garage that is near Daly Plaza and therefore the school book depository. On the morning of November 22nd, 1963, this was different. This building did not exist. This was just kind of open land. This is where Wesley Fraser and Lee Harvey Oswald actually parked the vehicle, in which they wandered into this building and through the rear entrance. This is Love Field. Shortly after leaving the hotel, the president was taken to Carswell Air Force Base and was flown a brief 13 minutes to this airport, where Air Force One would land and do a whole big show and show the people of Dallas the president was in town. Fundamentally, this was totally unnecessary, but it was for political purposes once again. From this point, after the president got off of the plane, he and Mrs. Kennedy would go down to the crowd and greet a lot of the people, shake a lot of hands, which actually, funny enough, got the Secret Service incredibly concerned. Kennedy was actually very well known for ditching his Secret Service. From here, the presidential motorcade would begin. It would consist, of course, of the Kennedys, as well as Governor John Connally in one vehicle, while Vice President Lyndon Johnson and Lady Bird Johnson were in a separate vehicle. The goal was to get to a location known as the Trade Mart. It had been selected by Governor Connally, which did create a little bit of suspicion on him after the assassination. However, he was completely absolved of this when it was found out he himself had actually been completely opposed to a parade motorcade. He was overridden personally by President Kennedy, who wanted to be seen in downtown Dallas by the people of Dallas, to be portrayed as one of the people. Unfortunately for history, it was anticipated to rain. Had it done so, Secret Service, as well as the Kennedys themselves, would have no doubt used a bubble top. Secret Service did encourage a bubble top on the car, but Kennedy overrode them simply due to the lack of the weather problem. At around noon, Lee Harvey Oswald is still working so as to not arouse suspicion. He is seen by several co-workers throughout the day doing his normal routine. It is presumed that around noon he headed up to the 6th floor of the school book depository and began to establish the sniper's nest. Lots of conflicting reports place him in different places. However, it is worth noting a lot of the testimony that was given was all basically guesswork, and some were given 15, if not even 20 years after the fact, largely discounting their value. It's around this time that Lee Harvey Oswald would no doubt have unwrapped the package he had brought with him, which likely contained the Carcano rifle. The presidential motorcade came down this street, Main Street, in which it took a right and then turned onto this street, Houston, and then took a left onto Elm up there, right in front of the book depository. From the 6th floor at approximately 12:30, Lee Harvey Oswald is alleged to have fired 3 shots in the direction of the motorcade from this spot.
At this point, I just kind of want to slow everything down a little bit and kind of talk about the events that are happening kind of in slow motion. So from the window of the 6th floor depository on the far corner, that's where Oswald was when he fired the shots at approximately 12:30. Now, only about 30 seconds to a minute before, it obviously would have been 12:29. So let's just review again when the motorcade, the route I just described to you, we can actually kind of visualize it here. So it turns onto Houston, goes slowly down there. A lot of people note that Oswald didn't fire directly on the motorcade. I have my own theory on that, but we'll talk about that later. It takes this awkward, slow turn onto Elm. Now, people ask, like, why did it go so slow? Well, it was a motorcade. That was kind of the whole point, is you're supposed to be able to see the individual. They would never do this today. A lot of rules have changed because of the assassination. But then he finds his moment and he takes his shots, which he misses the first, the second one ends up hitting, and the third one is the fatal headshot. After that, it speeds onward over to Parkland Hospital, where the president is operated on. We're currently standing up on the 7th floor of the book depository. Right below me is the angle in which Lee Harvey Oswald is alleged to have fired the shots. And I gotta say, when you look out the window, I know the trees would have changed a bit and everything. It's not really hard to see that he could have definitely potentially made those shots. Now, I'm no expert on guns, but at least from an angle perspective, it was there. Here on Elm Street, just by the school book depository, the city of Dallas has actually marked the spots in which the shots were fired. 2 are down here, and further down the way is the 3rd one where the fatal headshot actually occurred. This seemingly little insignificant block is where Abraham Zapruder once stood while filming the infamous Kennedy assassination footage. From this vantage point, he was able to capture all these shots. That footage was used to be able to time the assassination down to 3 specific shots. If you ever really study that footage, which unfortunately I can't show you because, believe it or not, it's not public domain, the first shot is known to have missed. In the footage, you can actually see Kennedy react to it by just kind of looking around for a second. He stops waving, and then he goes back to waving. The second shot is the one that's known as the magic bullet shot, where it went through Kennedy's throat. After he comes from behind the sign, you can actually see the president is visibly holding his neck, indicating he has in fact been shot. That same shot, according to the Warren Commission, is what was responsible for the additional wounds in Governor John Connally in both his back and his hand. I forget the specifics, but that bullet is supposed to account for it. The third shot, which is captured on film, is the ultimate head wound that killed President Kennedy. This is a vantage point seen by many people involved in the assassination. Famously, Mary Moorman was standing right about here when she took an infamous photo of not only the final head wound, as well as the infamous grassy knoll. While I don't personally subscribe to it, the most common conspiracy theory is that a second shooter was standing right here and fired the fatal headshot over to President Kennedy. The one argument for this case that kind of holds water to me is the bullet ballistics. After the bullets they checked with the Oswald rifle, the throat wound was consistent with the Carcano, but the head wound seemed a tad inconsistent, though proper bullet ballistics were apparently never really done. This is the vantage point of the grassy knoll, which is why it's popular to believe that someone was here, they would easily be able to hit this mark. I can see where that might make sense, but I personally, again, don't subscribe to the idea. However, one Lee Bowers used to work in this tower over here, and he would claim he saw a few vehicles coming in and out and potentially saw a second shooter, but was never really sure. Lee Bowers was found dead only a couple of years later. One of the less common conspiracy theories was the idea of a second shooter actually being placed right here in this sewer drain. From there, had the shooter been positioned here and stayed there, they would have had a relatively clean shot shooting up and towards the motorcade.
While the idea of a conspiracy theory is interesting and potentially even entertaining, I personally don't attribute to malice what you can credit to incompetence. It is well known now that the Dallas police investigators didn't exactly do the most thorough job with the process, being very sloppy in a lot of cases, most notably handling the expelled bullet casings from the Gargano rifle before they were even photographed. It is entirely possible, we now know, that they might have simply misplaced a few of the shots, hence we only think of 3 shots because only 3 shells were officially found. But it's possible more were misplaced, or even the possibility Oswald recovered a few and took them and disposed of them in separate locations. Again, it's really hard to believe in mass organization when things are so easy to screw up. Humans are not really that good at organization. We think we are, we're kind of not. Here, where the fatal head wound occurred, people often point to the idea of the fact that Kennedy's head went back into the left as a conspiracy, further evidence the idea of the grassy knoll second shooter, pointing to the idea that the bullet physics would have pushed him that way. People often overlook the fact that while Kennedy was portrayed as this young, robust, healthy president, he was actually possibly one of the most medically incapacitated presidents we ever had, taking all sorts of medications. In fact, at the time of the shooting, he was actually wearing a back brace which held him up in the position he was in. It is very notable that after the initial bullet wound to his neck, he doesn't hunch over because he physically can't. The back brace is preventing that. So had he not been wearing it, it's very likely he actually would have been able to avoid the head wound entirely. People also like to point to the idea that the motorcade driver potentially was in on the conspiracy because as he gets to about this point, he slows the car down even to an almost stop, potentially aiding the would-be shooters. I would like to point out to everyone out there that the human mind tends to panic in moments of high tension where you don't understand what's happening, you just know there's drama and you're fearful. It is very likely the the driver simply wanted the situation to stop. And as far as they thought was, let's stop, which is the only thing I can control is this car, I'm going to stop it. This is not evidence of a conspiracy. It's evidence of the deer in headlights effect. He was a human being and that he just messed up. And as soon as he came to his, senses, he drove off. Further evidence of this is the Zapruder film itself, in which Jackie Kennedy no doubt knew that jumping on the trunk of the car to grab brain matter and scalp material was not in any way going to aid the president. But in those moments of heightened panic and fear, you don't act rationally. This is not evidence of a conspiracy, it's evidence of being human. I want to take a minute to talk about some of the eyewitness testimony and how complicated that can actually be, given how many conflicting accounts occur. One of the most interesting examples to me is one of an individual named Howard Brennan, who was at the time of the shooting was sitting right here. Now, uniquely, that gave him a single vantage point that no one else had. You have to remember at the time of the shooting, everybody would be focusing on Kennedy's motorcade. They would not be focusing on him, including when he went down here. That's actually part of the reason I believe Oswald fired the shots after the motorcade turned, because no one would be looking in that general direction, whereas they would be looking in that general direction had he shot it while he was still here on Houston Street. But shooting on Elm, nobody's looking up there. The one exception to that was Howard Brennan. He claimed he sat here looking right onto the street, which gave him a positive ID angle of the 6th floor of the depository. He would go on to claim he could absolutely positively ID as Lee Harvey Oswald as the shooter, seeing him, quote, very clearly. However, he was unwilling to positively ID him until after Oswald was killed by Jack Ruby out of fear that this was some sort of communist conspiracy that would threaten his own life. Situations like this, testimonial like this, is further evidence that the whole situation was very complicated and it's hard to truly get to the bottom of it. If there was a conspiracy, you would think that more than one person, Howard Brennan, who is at best sketch about his testimony, would have been able to positively identify Oswald. If he was the patsy and there were conspirators who really wanted everyone to know this was him, you would probably have a bunch of people around who all could say, that was definitely him, I totally saw him. Maybe a picture, maybe some video. If this was all an elaborate plot, why not have any of that evidence? Instead, we have none of that. We have one person saying they could positively identify him and was still unwilling to. That should tell you a lot. There are a million what-if scenarios to the Kennedy assassination. One I'd like to focus on is the story of Bonnie Williams. Now, Bonnie Williams, at the time of the assassination, was on the 5th floor with 2 other employees right underneath where Oswald is alleged to have fired the shots. But interestingly, only 10 minutes, possibly even 5 prior, he actually was up on the 6th floor eating his lunch. Now, at that time, he was only 2 windows away from, again, where Oswald was presumed to have fired the shots. Bonnie would claim that there was a ton of boxes over there, and he had no reason to think anybody would be there, that in the eventual sniper's perch. Thus, he could not actually see anything. I wonder, of course, had he stayed on the 6th floor, how does history change? Does Oswald know he's there and Oswald decides not to fire because he doesn't want to get caught? Does Oswald fire anyway and then Williams catches him in the act and he can testify against him later? Does Oswald kill Bonnie Ray Williams? Does Oswald get tackled by him and immediately apprehended by police? These are the what ifs we'll never know, but it is fascinating that everything kind of just had to go wrong in order for this to happen. After the shooting is, of course, completed, the motorcade proceeds to whiz straight down the street under the overpass. In the infamous footage, you see it run beyond that sign and into there. At that point, it heads on to Parkland Hospital, where it manages to get there only a few minutes later. At this point, it's absolute pandemonium here in Dealey Plaza shortly after the assassination. One person who actually had a sense of forethought and foresight was Officer Marion Baker. He had reportedly seen a bunch of birds flying off the top of the school book depository. He was actually on his motorcycle situated about here where these people are right now. At that moment in time, he decides to get off his bike and run all the way up into the book depository, where he is greeted by Roy Truly. Shortly after the shooting, Lee Harvey Oswald runs to the opposite side of the 6th floor, places the Carcano rifle down, and runs down to the 2nd floor. Approximately 90 seconds after the shooting, he encounters Officer Marion Baker as well as his boss, Roy Truly. Marion Baker asks who he is, if he's an employee, does he know him? Roy Truly says yes, he works here. Marion Baker ends up running off. 90 seconds. This leads to a lot of conspiracy theories about the possibility of that happening, but it's hard to prove. It's all rough estimation. A few minutes after the shooting, President Kennedy would arrive here. He was ultimately rushed up to Trauma Room 1, where doctors would attempt to resuscitate him. We are unable to show you the original location, unfortunately, as it was demolished. This is the new location, which will have to stand in for our purposes. At 12:35 p.m., about 5 minutes after the assassination, Lee Harvey Oswald is seen exiting the front door of the school book depository, heads down Elm, and goes a few blocks. Ended up coming here to this actual bus stop on Elm and Lamar. He waits here for a couple minutes, boards the first bus out of here. Once he's done that, he's on the bus for only a matter of minutes before he realizes that everything is ground to a halt and he chooses not to stay there. He eventually gets off said bus and hails a cab a few blocks away. While doctors were able to maintain a heartbeat in the president for some time, he would ultimately pass away at 12:57, approximately 27 minutes after the shooting. Between 1 and 1:30 p.m., about a half hour after the assassination, the Texas School Book Depository is completely locked down. Investigators have begun searching the site and noticed that one Lee Harvey Oswald is actually missing. He was not the only employee that was missing that day. However, he's the only employee who went missing after the assassination. This immediately made him a subject of interest. At around 1 p.m., Lee Harvey Oswald returns to the rooming house for the final time. He goes inside, he changes his clothes, he comes out, and he moves on with his day. It is possible around this time, this is purely speculation, he may have discarded of additional shells he grabbed while still at the book depository. Approximately 15 minutes or so after leaving the rooming house, Oswald is next seen here. This is the site in which he was stopped by an officer named J.D. Tippit. Now, Tippit had been told over his radio to keep an eye out for a suspect fitting Oswald's description. When he saw Oswald, he stopped him, got out of the car, and Oswald, presumably in a panic, used the pistol he had just retrieved to shoot and murder Officer J.D. Tippit. Shortly after leaving, multiple witnesses decided to try and inform the police of this. One actually got onto J.D. Tippit's radio personally and contacted the officers. Officers had managed to track down the rifle at 1:22 p.m. It took almost no time. It was only a matter of hours before they traced it back to an A. Heidel who had bought it from Klein Sporting Goods in Chicago. A. Heidel, as a reminder, was an alias for Lee Harvey Oswald. At approximately 1:26 p.m., then Vice President Johnson is informed he is effectively the 36th President of the United States. Now, Secret Service has to go through an unbelievable effort to get him out of here. You have to remember, at the time, it was unknown if this was some greater conspiracy, potentially involving multiple collaborators, possibly an attack by the Soviet Union to take down the United States government. Everything was completely unknown. Secret Service went above and beyond to get President Johnson, or what would be about to become President Johnson, over to Love Field. At this exact same time is pretty much when the news went out to the world that John F. Kennedy, 35th President of the United States, was in fact dead. At around 1:35 p.m., this is the next place Lee Harvey Oswald is known to have been. At the time, this was called Hardy's Shoe Store. It was run by a man named Johnny Brewer, who happened to be listening to the radio, which had largely talked about the Kennedy assassination and had just put out news about J.D. Tippit. He saw Oswald, who was acting not only suspicious, but met the description. He would actually kind of somewhat kick Oswald out of this area and follow him down the street, ultimately contacting police officers, believing believing he had seen the man who had shot J.D. Tippit. It's kind of interesting. You can actually see why Lee Harvey Oswald would actually consider hiding out here. Unlike the other stores, this has kind of a hidden little alcove in it that would allow you to get off of street view. Potentially, if he was in a panic and just trying to collect himself, being right here, there is a certain logic to it. After coming out of here, Lee Harvey Oswald proceeds up this street to what you can see there is the Texas Theater. At around 1:38 p.m., Ruth Paine and Marina Oswald are in the living room of the house, in which they're watching television informed of the death of President Kennedy. Ruth Paine then mentions to Marina that it's interesting that the building that the commotion supposedly happened at was the same one in which Lee worked at. Perhaps in a panic, feeling her heart sink, Marina would later comment that at that time she decided to go into the garage to check on the rifle that Lee Harvey Oswald owned. Partially because she knew him and probably speculated the possibility that he might have done this, considering what he is suspected to have done to General Edwin Walker in the attempted assassination there. She ends up seeing the blanket on the ground in its usual position, which was known to cover the rifle, and decides not to touch it any further, believing it's there, he had nothing to do with this. This is the Texas Theater. Now, at about 1:40 p.m., Lee Harvey Oswald, despite having money in his pocket, decides, presumably in a panic, to try and see a movie to hide away from people. He goes into the theater without paying for the ticket. In addition to the actions of Johnny Brewer, the staff of the place is very much concerned about what just happened, especially after hearing what Johnny Brewer just told them. They call police, who eventually descend upon this place. They stop the movie, which was a film called War is Hell. They lift up the lights, they go inside, and they arrest Oswald. When Oswald stands up, he attempts to shoot one of the officers and says, "This is it." However, the gun fails to fire. They capture him, they punch him, hence the black eye he has in all the footage. He is taken away and arrested by police officers right in front of this building. It's now around 2 p.m. Lyndon Johnson is gone, but Jackie Kennedy still remains with President Kennedy's body. Unwilling to leave the city of Dallas without Jackie Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson insists on her return. She is unwilling to leave without the body, therefore the Secret Service must take the casket with them. Now, this technically violated Texas state law in that the body was part of a criminal investigation and was required to stay. Secret Service was unwilling to comply with this law and remove the body. This was technically illegal, but under the circumstances was considered somewhat understandable. Lee Harvey Oswald was brought into custody here at what used to be known as the Old City Hall. At this point, he is charged with the murder of Officer J.D. Tippit. However, at this point, it is worth noting he is not really involved with the Kennedy assassination in official capacity. Captain Fritz shows up and tells his investigators he wants them to go find a search warrant and arrest a Lee Harvey Oswald, or at least question him about the possibility of a connection to JFK. The reason being was that he was the only employee known to have been at the school book depository who was not there during roll call. He was simply wanted for questioning. Now, famously, when he came in and asked them that, they said, "We'll save you a trip. He's in the other room. We arrested him for the murder of J.D. Tippit." While Johnson had been on the plane, there was a gap before President Kennedy's body could arrive. There was very little thought given to the process of what to do with his body once he got there. Only about 5 minutes or so, it was even acknowledged as a problem. Initially, it was thought, I guess they could just put him in the cargo hold, but this felt extremely insulting and demeaning to the late president. So, in a panic, a bunch of Secret Service ended up removing a whole bunch of chairs out of the cabin of the plane, as well as cutting part of the shape of the entryway, thus allowing the casket to fit in so that it could ride amongst the crew in the cabin along with Mrs. Kennedy. At this point, Lyndon Johnson is about to be sworn in as to become the 36th president of the United States. This was done by over the phone via Bobby Kennedy, who was then the Attorney General. Very likely the hardest thing Bobby Kennedy ever had to do, as not only did he just lose his brother, he also absolutely despised Lyndon Johnson. The plane then took off for Washington, D.C. At around 3 p.m., investigators began their interrogation of Lee Harvey Oswald, in what is perhaps one of the most egregious and offensive moments in American history. The investigators did not have a tape recorder, nor did they have sufficient note-taking skills or Oswald having a lawyer present. This meant there's a very poor historical record of what he was actually saying during those times. At this point, Oswald is still not charged with the assassination of the president. However, he is tested for gunpowder to see if he had fired a weapon that day. It came back positive. He had indeed fired guns that day. At around 4 p.m., investigators thoroughly search Lee Harvey Oswald and find an additional 4 bullet cartridges on his person. This is the same ammunition used in the Garcano rifle. At around 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Air Force One lands here at Andrews Air Force Base in Washington, D.C. While Kennedy's body is taken away, Johnson also prepares for his first speech as President of the United States. Here at Bethesda Naval Hospital, now known as Walter Reed Hospital, the autopsy of John F. Kennedy begins at 7:35 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That evening at around 7 p.m., Captain Fritz of the Dallas Police Department showed up here at the Ruth Payne house to interrogate not only Ruth and Michael Payne, but as well as Marina Oswald. Upon entering, they were informed that no, Lee's rifle is definitely in the garage. Marina took them to the same blanket she had investigated earlier. The police decided to open up the blanket to discover that the rifle was in fact not there. Marina, no doubt at this point in time, realized had she changed her actions that morning or the evening prior, it is very likely the assassination would never have occurred. This day was obviously painful for Jackie Kennedy for a million different reasons, but knowing she went into this house without him and that in a very short time she'd have to suddenly leave and have a whole new life added to that must have been an unbelievable source of stress. She spent a very hard and no doubt very awkward night here on November 22nd, 1963. It is now November 23rd, 1963, the day after the assassination. At just past midnight Eastern Standard Time, the autopsy of John F. Kennedy is completed. Now, the method in which the autopsy was handled in conjunction with the medical attempts made at Parkland have also been the subject of ridicule and conspiracy for years. At 1:35 in the morning, Lee Harvey Oswald is charged formally with the assassination of the 35th President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. At approximately 3:56 a.m. Eastern Time, President Kennedy's body would be brought here. It would remain in the White House until November 25th. The majority of this day simply consists of additional interrogations in which Oswald is allowed to speak to his brother Robert, as well as his wife Marina. While he gives additional clues, he never actually confesses to anything. It is now November 24th, 1963, 2 days after the assassination. As Jackie Kennedy is mourning the loss of President Kennedy, she's trying to see what she can do to enhance his legacy, to make people remember him. So she actually goes around and starts asking people what they remember about the three previously assassinated presidents. Of course, a lot of people remembered who Abraham Lincoln was, but nobody knew who William McKinley or James A. Garfield were. She was afraid that this might be Jack Kennedy's fate, so in an attempt to avoid that, she came up with a very elaborate funeral plan that would ultimately happen the next day. There was no limit to the protests from both the Secret Service as well as President Johnson, but all of which agreed finally to do what Jackie Kennedy had wanted. That morning, Dallas police decide to move Lee Harvey Oswald to a more secured facility, concerned about his safety and a potential citizen possibly taking the law into their own hands. They actually come here to this spot, and police armored car goes down to escort Lee Harvey Oswald. A local nightclub owner by the name of Jack Ruby, who was very friendly with Dallas police and very familiar with this facility, simply walked in. He ended up shooting Lee Harvey Oswald point blank. He claimed he had done it for Jackie Kennedy as he had been a big fan and, quote, wanted to spare her the pain of a trial. Lee Harvey Oswald was brought here to the same place, Parkland Hospital's trauma center, as President John F. Kennedy. He was whisked upstairs and set up for trauma room 1, the exact same room President Kennedy had died in. However, an on-call nurse basically said, no matter if he lives or dies, it's not happening in that room, and forced him into room 2. Doctors attempted to resuscitate him, mostly in an attempt to try and keep him alive for confession and further information. He would expire at 1:07 p.m., approximately 48 hours after John F. Kennedy had died, only a matter of feet away in a different room. This time, the medical examiner was given absolutely no trouble in keeping Oswald's body. Police formally charged Jack Ruby with the death and murder of Lee Harvey Oswald, and he was held in custody until 1966. It was felt that he was unable to get a fair trial in the city of Dallas. While they waited to see where else they could potentially move him, he would die in January of 1967 from lung cancer, depriving us of more information and also robbing us of the opportunity to find out from Lee Harvey Oswald what exactly transpired that day, November 22nd, 1963. It is now November 25th, 1963, 3 days after the assassination. The funeral procession of President John F. Kennedy begins. It ends up touring around all parts of the city on its way to Arlington Cemetery. Now, various heads of state from other countries would come in. Even in a class move, the Soviet Union would send representation to march along with everybody. President Johnson did ultimately walk along with the Kennedys. This was interesting because not only did you have heads of state actually visit, other countries would mourn the loss as well. Here in the United Kingdom, though not technically, this site sits on what is known as 1 American acre. Where I'm standing is actually sovereign U.S. soil. In 1965, 2 years after the assassination, the late Queen Elizabeth of England decided to allow the memorial to be built. This site is just one example of how various countries around the world reacted to the death of President Kennedy. Now, interestingly, at the exact same time the Kennedy funeral begins, the Oswald funeral actually begins to far less fanfare. Lee Harvey Oswald, who is buried right here, was visited only by his immediate family, his brother Robert, his mother, his wife Marina, their children, as well as a few members of the press, and interestingly, Secret Service, who had the ironic duty of taking care of the Oswald family. Due to how few people were in attendance for Lee Harvey Oswald's funeral, most of which being women and children, Lee Harvey Oswald's daughters specifically, it was actually difficult for them to even do the basic logistics. They didn't have pallbearers. Robert Oswald Lee Harvey Oswald's brother, actually had to approach the media members just asking for a basic decency and a favor to help him carry the body, which they ultimately did. This is the final resting place of President John F. Kennedy. The eternal flame is meant to burn on and represent the hopes and dreams he attempted to bring to the nation. The design and the site was selected by Jackie Kennedy. She had commented that recently the two had taken a trip here, and John had commented on how he liked the spot. The eternal flame idea came from inspiration she had seen. However, she only came up with it the night before the burial. The Army Corps of Engineers had a very long night getting this to work. In case it isn't obvious, this gravesite doesn't actually say Lee Harvey Oswald. It simply says Oswald. The purpose of this was basically to attract as little attention to the site as possible. Despite that, over the years, of course, many people have found it. People have also willingly damaged it. There's been a lot of actual defecation and urination and all sorts of things, people spitting on it. For reasons unknown completely to us, someone has placed a quarter on Oswald's grave. I almost thought that was going to be a Kennedy $50, which I kind of could see, but a regular state quarter, no idea. In a strange, potentially bizarre additional coincidence, someone has placed some sort of coin on the Kennedy grave, which you might have noticed there was one on top of the Oswald grave as well. Less than a week after the assassination, after effectively being kicked out of the White House by then President Johnson, Jackie Kennedy returned here to the Kennedys' former home in Georgetown, just outside of Washington, D.C. So ultimately, we have to wonder, final thoughts, was it all a conspiracy? Now, frankly, that's beyond the scope of this video, and that's not really what I'm aiming to point at, but I will say, personally, I don't really think so. I look at this situation, and I see a man who I could not necessarily credit to malice, what I can credit to incompetence. There was no organized plan. This was just an individual acting, and he just happened to get lucky. The truth is, Lee Harvey Oswald, was a violent person seeking fame. It explains why he went after General Edwin Walker. He had no great political hatred for Kennedy. He just saw an opportunity to become famous, to make his mark, per se, and he took it. Now, maybe he got radicalized a little bit in New Orleans. That's purely speculative. But it's also possible this is a thing that happened with his mother. His mother was famously crazy, believing her son was a secret agent and all this other nonsense. He might have been, in the early stages of some sort of degenerative mental process. Frankly, we don't really know. The truth is, he didn't really need a great plan. He simply used the building he had access to, and he more or less lucked out with the idea that the presidential motorcade was going to run right near where he worked. He used a gun he already had access to rather than buying a new one. He just used one that he knew he had in a convenient location. Now, we have a ton of investigation mistakes from places like the CIA, the FBI, Dallas Police Department, the Secret Service, and so on, that makes this all look like a convenient little conspiracy, that somehow they're all in on it. But it's far more likely that a bunch of human beings just screwed up in a series of different ways that ultimately led to one of the most significant tragedies in American history. Similar lax security would ultimately lead to 9/11, where a couple of hijackers would just manage to take down a few planes and a few buildings as well. What makes things like the Kennedy assassination and 9/11 seem like good conspiracy fodder is that it's hard to believe something seemingly so secure, with so much money and effort put in, could be broken down by just a couple of individuals with just kind of a haphazard plan. But the truth is, sometimes a crime of opportunity strikes where you just find a hole. In the end, Lee Harvey Oswald was just an individual seeking fame. And unfortunately for history, he ended up getting it. At the time of this recording, it's worth mentioning that several people associated with the assassination mentioned in this video are actually still alive. Ruth Paine, Wesley Fraser, and most notably, of course, Marina Oswald. Due to the assassination, Wesley Fraser changed his name. Ruth Paine ended up getting back together with her husband, Michael, and Marina ended up getting remarried. Her and her daughters ceased to use the last name Oswald, of course, and have stayed mostly out of public view since, in an effort to get some sort of peace and semblance of a normal life. As we stand here 60 years later, one must wonder what happened to some of the artifacts associated with the Kennedy assassination. Where are Lee Harvey Oswald's guns? Where are the Kennedys' clothing? Where is Abraham Zapruder's camera? How about the presidential limousine? Air Force One itself? What ended up happening to some of these? Unfortunately, we don't have access to most of these, but a few of the items are actually kept here in the National Archives, specifically Lee Harvey Oswald's guns, the Kennedys' clothing, and Abraham Zapruder's camera. These are not on display to the public yet. Presumably they will be someday when nobody is old enough to remember the events of that day. While there are replicas available of some of these, such as Zapruder's camera as well as Lee Harvey Oswald's rifle at the 6th Floor Museum in Dallas, those are replicas. The originals are stored here. When it comes to infamous Kennedy assassination imagery, there is actually one thing we do have access to, and that would be this, and it stands out above many of the rest. This is the infamous presidential limousine that JFK was unfortunately shot in on that horrible day on November 22nd, 1963 in Dallas. The car was actually originally built for Kennedy specifically and was given to the White House in June of 1961. It was given various customization options, including the infamous bubble top, which sadly was not used that day in Dallas. After taking the Kennedys to Parkland, it was brought back to Love Field and was escorted back to Washington, D.C. on the cargo plane that had brought it there in the first place. After landing in Andrews Air Force Base, the car was actually driven directly to the White House. From there, staff from Bethesda Naval Hospital would show up and gather blood samples, bone tissues, and other fragments for the investigation. The car was sent to Cincinnati, Ohio in December of 1963 for restoration and returned to Washington, D.C. in June of 1964 for President Johnson's use. This included an extensive amount of security upgrades as well as a brand new paint job. Though given the history of the vehicle, unsurprisingly, President Johnson was not particularly interested in using it. When Richard Nixon became president, he was a tad more keen on the idea of it, but he again made changes to it and had additional upgrades made to it. Eventually, Presidents both Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter would briefly use it. The car was retired under Jimmy Carter in 1977, briefly into his term. While it's unfortunate from a historical perspective that the car was changed and modified so many times, it's not hard to see why. Here in the rear of the limousine, you have the two most infamous seats. On the right would be where First Lady Jackie Kennedy was sitting, and on the left is where President John F. Kennedy, 35th President of the United States, was sitting at that fateful moment at 12:30 p.m. on November 22nd, 1963, at the time of the shooting. An infamous vehicle associated with the Kennedy assassination is, of course, this, Air Force One. It was from this aircraft that Kennedy landed in Texas, and his body was taken back to Washington, D.C. Aboard this plane, Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as the 36th President of the United States. Originally built in 1962 specifically for the Kennedy administration, this was the first modern version of Air Force One. Previous administrations from Roosevelt, Truman, and Eisenhower had vehicles named Air Force One, as that's a title given to any aircraft an active president is currently on. This is the first modern version of what we think of the Air Force One as today. The paint scheme was designed by Jackie Kennedy. The color theme is still used to this day. You have Jackie Kennedy to thank for this imagery. This iteration was also the primary version of Air Force One for both President Johnson and Nixon, though it was retired for the incumbent president in 1972, which would have been Richard Nixon. After that, it became the backup vehicle for Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush, and Clinton administrations. After that, it would go on to serve multiple purposes for transporting former presidents, heads of state, dignitaries, and more. The final official mission for this was to transport Vice President Al Gore in 1998. We're going to go inside of it, and they basically put that little frame there because inside it's a very tight fit. So they're basically saying if you can't fit through there, then don't go inside, because they have everything walled off. But since they actually allow us the opportunity to check out Air Force One, we're going to do it. Now keep in mind that the plane was modernized and changed a lot after Kennedy's time. Again, it was used by the Johnson administration, the Nixon administration, and technically all the way up to the Clinton administration. So a lot of changes and modifications were made. So not too much of it is actually accurate to the way Kennedy was, but there are a few spots that are definitely worth pointing out. This one, probably the most obvious, right here, is where Lyndon Johnson took the oath of office. So you can actually see the door frame there, which is right there. So he would have been standing pretty much right where I'm standing right now when he was sworn in as the 36th President of the United States. And then further walking along, there's a couple other spots to point out. Right here, along this side, is where the casket was laid. John F. Kennedy, his casket was placed there, and Mrs. Kennedy sat right there with him the whole time for the flight back to D.C. And you might remember earlier I mentioned how the wall was cut, the entryway was cut to allow the casket to get up here and rotate in. This is basically the cut indication. They just kind of, I guess, kept it as a reminder, but that's essentially what it says. And yeah, that's surreal, thinking the Kennedy casket was right there. After 60 years, what exactly happened to all the locations involved with the Kennedy assassination? Today, 227 West Washington no longer is the home of Klein Sporting Goods. In fact, it technically doesn't even exist anymore, as this is 225. There is no 227 anymore, possibly in response to the assassination. In 1968, the concept of mail-order guns was made illegal, in part due to the assassination. Milt Klein, the then owner, sold the business. He lived with the guilt of being the guy who sold the rifle to Lee Harvey Oswald for the rest of his life. But to be fair, it really was not his fault. Today, the Oswald home is considered a historic site and is largely left untouched. It is not something you can go in, however, you are free to walk around and take photos and so on and so forth. Today, the Ruth Paine House is an active museum. If you wish to visit it as we did, all you have to do is go on their website and book a time, and they were happy to give you a guided tour. The building, once known as the Texas School Book Depository, is now known as the Dallas County Administration Building. The 6th floor contains what is known as the 6th Floor Museum. which pays a big memorial to everything that happened here on the events of that day, November 22nd, 1963. Today, the Hotel Texas is now known as the Hilton Fort Worth. A statue and a monument was erected to depict where Kennedy's final public appearance was. There is no room known as 805 at the Hilton Fort Worth. It was split into two rooms, one called 808 and one called 810. The numbers go then sequentially from 806 down to 804, 803, 802, and so on. However, you actually can still stay in it, despite the fact that it is exorbitantly expensive. Inside the hotel, there are a few simple mentions and of references to the fact that Kennedys stayed here on their final night as a couple. Today, Love Field is still an active major commercial airport for the city of Dallas. It is primarily used as a southwest hub. Dealey Plaza today is still an active part of downtown Dallas. It is also very much a tourist hotspot and hub where a lot of people come to see the JFK Memorial and more. Obviously, over time, the trees and shrubbery have changed significantly. The old sign has also been removed. Today, Parkland Hospital is an active hospital. It has been completely rebuilt, and most remnants of when Kennedy was here are long gone. There is a memorial in the radiology department. We wish to go and check it out, but a couple of girls who didn't even know who JFK seemed to be told us we weren't allowed to go see it. The original Trauma Room 1 was removed from this site and taken up to a storage facility somewhere in Kansas City where it is off limits to this day. This is the bus stop Lee Harvey Oswald used shortly after the assassination. As you can see today, it is still an active bus stop, but no doubt has been modernized. The Lee Harvey Oswald rooming house, as it is now known, today is actually an active museum. You can rent appointments here to go inside and see the place. We didn't do that. Today, the site of J.D. Tippett's murder remains an active home and residential area. At the intersection of Patton and 10th, there is actually a memorial denoting the events that occurred here. Today, Hardy's Shoes has become Liz's Bridal and Quinceañera, which, as you can tell, sells dresses. This is one of the most significant yet very misunderstood and least talked about locations in the Kennedy assassination. Today, the Texas Theater remains an active movie theater. Every owner, including the one that owned it at the time up until the current one, has decided to keep the Lee Harvey Oswald seat marked. I would love to go inside and show you. Unfortunately, it just happens to not be open today. Today, the old City Hall is renovated and has become a college. There's very little remnants of what actually used to be the Dallas Police Station. However, there is actually a museum inside, but it is completely inaccessible to the public. They do allow virtual tours, so unfortunately, we couldn't check it out ourselves. Today, Bethesda Naval Hospital has been renamed Walter Reed Hospital. It is an active military hospital and has had notable expansions and improvements over the years. The original building here was conceived of under Franklin Roosevelt's administration. Over time, multiple presidents have added to it. Most recently, George W. Bush actually broke ground here with a huge expansion. Today, Andrews Air Force Base remains an active U.S. military site. The name Andrews Air Force Base simply refers to the airfield portion of Joint Base Andrews. U.S. presidents still use this as a base for Air Force One. Today, JFK's Air Force One is on display free to the public at the U.S. Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. Today, the JFK presidential limousine is on site for the public to see at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, just outside of Detroit. Today, the National Archives Museum is a museum. It contains some of America's most important documentation, including the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, and the Declaration of Independence. Presumably, one day, the JFK artifacts will be on display here. Today, the White House remains, of course, the White House. This is the residence for whoever is the incumbent POTUS, President of the United States, at any one time to serve out the entirety of their term. Today, the gravesite of Lee Harvey Oswald is very accessible to the public. It is visible at Shannon Rose Cemetery in Fort Worth, Texas. All you need to do is put into Google Maps that that's where you want to go, and it will actually pinpoint this specific location. Interestingly, there was also a conspiracy theory that basically declared this is not the true resting place of Lee Harvey Oswald. This got so much attention that in 1981, the body was actually exhumed and DNA tested. Surprise, surprise, it revealed this is, in fact, the body of Lee Harvey Oswald. Today, Arlington Cemetery remains an active grave site for military personnel. The original site was redesigned in 1967 for something a little more permanent over the kind of haphazard overnight construction of the Eternal Flame. Later, additional changes would be made so that the Kennedys could continue to extend their family to be buried near the president. In wrapping this video up, I first want to give a huge shout out to my buddy Brett Weiss. He was the guy in Dallas willing to drive me around. He also stood in as my Lee Harvey Oswald. So I'll put links in the description to his content. Thank you so much, Brett. And I want to thank you guys as well. Hopefully, if you liked any part of this video, that you will consider subscribing, liking the video, sharing it around, etc. I appreciate the support. But also, as you can imagine, this video was extremely difficult to compile, and it required me to travel all across the United States and even make my way out to the United Kingdom just to get footage. So if you appreciated that, I would appreciate your support in not only liking the video, etc., but also consider donating, joining my join page, hitting the Patreon. I'll even put a PayPal link in there if you're willing. Thank you so much. Hopefully, you guys want to see more content
content like this. I appreciate your support. So again, like this video, comment down below, subscribe if you've never done that before, and then check all the social media stuff like Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, etc. Thank you so much, and I'll see you all later.